Good afternoon. I'm Stephen Steer. I'm the interim director of the School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs. And I'm also the former director of the Foley Institute. Cornell Clayton, the director, asked me to substitute for him today. He's on the West Side giving a series of talks about incivility in politics. Before I introduce our distinguished guest, Richard asked me to make a couple of announcements. First of all, for students that are here, there are sign-in sheets available after the event outside in the hallway. He also wanted me to note a couple of upcoming Foley events next week. On Monday, October 2nd, Angela Sims will be here to talk about the connections between faith, race, and violence, with specific attention to historical and contemporary ethical implications of lynching in the United States. And on Tuesday, October 3rd, Washington State Liquor and Cannabis Board Chief of Enforcement, Justin Nordhorn, will be here to discuss the changing political dynamics of marijuana legalization in Washington State. So that's next Monday and next Tuesday. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Greg Lusk. He's a philosopher of environmental science and a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Chicago, with appointments in the Department of Philosophy and the Franke Institute for the Humanities. He's working on a project entitled Studies in Climate Change, the Limits of the Numerical. More generally, Dr. Lusk looks at how climate change policy is informed and shaped by scientific models and social values. Dr. Lusk received his PhD in philosophy of science from the University of Toronto, where his work examined the epistemic status of computer simulation modeling. His work has recently been published in Studies in History and Philosophy of Science and Climatic Change. So without further ado, Greg Lusk.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that kind introduction, Stephen. Thank you to the Foley Institute for having me, to Stephen and Richard, and Michael Goldsby for bringing me out. It's been a great trip so far. It's really my first time to this portion of the state, so I'm really excited to be here. I'm going to note something about my first slide. This is my title slide. You'll note that it says, climate change, who can we blame for extreme weather, ? The posters around campus don't have that question mark. It's implying that I know who we can blame for climate change, and that would be pretty bold of me to get up here and say that. So I'm not going to. I'm probably going to raise more questions than answers today. But let's begin. So, you probably cannot avoid seeing this in your everyday life. These are pictures of Hurricane Harvey last month that inundated Texas with severe flooding, damage, and destruction. And I want to point out the news headlines. Michael Mann, he's an eminent climate scientist at the Penn State. And, he wrote in The Guardian that it's a fact that climate change has made Hurricane Harvey more deadly. So about a year before Harvey, in Louisiana, there was severe flooding. And another study, again, being publicized by the Washington Post, says that climate change made these floods far more deadly. And you have my absolutely favorite atmospheric phenomena. I don't know if this got nearly as bad here as it did where I was living at the time. But the polar vortex was all the rage in 2014. It was an Arctic air invasion, in fact, of the United States. And it drove temperatures, usually in the Midwest and the prairies of Canada, down to extreme cold temperatures. And of course, as soon as it was happening, during it happening, U.S. News and World Report was asking, is climate change causing the polar vortex? And just because I had to add the slide, because this month Puerto Rico was hit Hurricane Maria. Almost the entire island is out of power. Many won't receive power, it looks like, for another year. The island has been absolutely devastated by this hurricane. So what do all of these events have in common? Well, one thing is a loss to human life. Harvey, 63 deaths have been attributed to that storm thus far. 13 through the Louisiana floods that I spoke of. Interestingly, you wouldn't think of this because floods and hurricanes get a lot of press. But 21 people, more than the Louisiana floods, died attributable to the polar vortex. I'm sure Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico will have devastating effects. There They also share in common wide-ranging destruction to public infrastructure due to flooding, due to freezing. Harvey is estimated to have taken out 134,000 buildings. That's an astonishing number. 40,000 homes were damaged or lost in Louisiana. And I could not find a statistic on the number of water mains that broke during the polar vortex, but I was assured that it was a significant number. They also share something else in common. The polar vortex supposedly cost the US economy $5 billion. Some of this came from canceled airline flights, lost work, and of course water main breaks. Louisiana floods cost $10 to $15 billion. The aftermath of Hurricane Harvey, cleaning up, looks to be possibly the most expensive storm in US history at $180 billion. Maria has devastated Puerto Rico. Who knows how much that's going to cost and what's been lost in that process. What else do these storms have in common, these events? They might have been influenced by climate change. So what if we could lay blame for these events? What if we could say that something or someone was responsible for them? One could see why governments, private industry, and citizens might be interested in laying this blame. Nations stricken by extreme weather could hold governments, those governments that benefited from fossil fuels, those nations, responsible for the damages incurred. Insurance companies could recoup their payouts to those damaged by suing those who might be liable for the causes of such events. Individual citizens might gain a moral status. They might gain the status of victims that could perhaps allow them special rights to migrate to certain other areas or receive compensation. All of these things are actively being talked about in the international political community in some way, shape, form, or another. And they are all driven by linking extreme weather with climate change. So I'm going to ask two questions today, and they both fall under the guise of this larger question: is extreme weather blameworthy? The first question I want to ask is, can we blame extreme weather on climate change? I'm going to give a qualified yes answer to that question and describe how we go about doing that scientifically. The second question I'm going to ask is, can we hold someone, and we're going to leave open who that is for now, responsible for the damages caused by that extreme weather? And this question is, although the scientific question is complicated, this one might be even more complicated than that. Okay, so can we blame extreme weather on climate change? So extreme weather attribution, that term, that kind of study, attempts to answer this question. Extreme weather attribution studies whether man-made global warming has influenced an extreme weather event, or extreme weather events of certain kinds. What do we need to know in order to figure out if an event or events of certain kinds have been influenced by extreme weather? Well, we live in an anthropogenically forced environment. This is represented by the image in red, orange, on the left. Right? This environment has the marks of human influence on it. The atmosphere has greenhouse gases that trap heat, aerosols that help reflect incoming radiation, and end up cooling the planet, and we put more, well, we don't really take these things out much, but we put more of them into the atmosphere than might be there naturally. We need to know how extreme weather behaves in this environment, the one that we have forced with these anthropogenic forcings. But in order to do that, we also need to know how the weather would have behaved in a natural environment, right? One where we didn't add greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, where we didn't add aerosols to the atmosphere. The difficulty is we don't have access to that natural environment, right? We only have one environment. We only have one planet. So we need to somehow figure out what extreme weather would look like in this natural environment when we only have access to that unnatural environment. So how can we know that extreme weather is different than it otherwise would have been? So one approach to this question is called the storyline approach to event attribution. And sort of walk you through it. Now, this is Hurricane Harvey from way up. And this approach says, let's grant that Hurricane Harvey occurred. We know that it occurred. We saw it occur. We're going to conditionalize our statements based on its occurrence. Now, we also know a few things about how the environment has changed due to climate change, right? So one thing is that sea surface temperature and atmospheric temperature has increased. And we know that as it increases, atmospheric air can hold more water vapor. There's a relation between how warm the air is and how much water vapor it can hold. Well, it happens to be that we know around when Harvey was gaining strength outside of Texas, that the water surface area was warmer than it otherwise would have been. It was warmer than average. Now, if we know that it's warmer than average, we know the hurricane occurred, and we know that the air holds more water in that case, we can know that when the storm reaches land, it's going to drop all that water on the land. So the inference that's happening is that more water was stored in the storm than otherwise would have been had those conditions been a little bit cooler. Because more water is stored there, when the storm actually hit Texas, it was able to drop more water than it otherwise would have been able to. Now, I've made that analysis look really easy and really hand-wavy. But to do this properly, this can take years for scientists to do properly, to get the proper observations, to ensure that the observations were in fact due to climate change, that the temperature difference was due to climate change, and then to do a proper analysis. That's one limitation of this procedure, but there are others. So this doesn't say anything about the frequency of the event, right? I've started my analysis by assuming that the event happened. So I can tell you that the event happened, that it was a little bit worse than it might have been. But I can't tell you, should we expect more of those events? This kind of analysis doesn't give you those answers. And one thing that I want to stress today is that it doesn't say what caused the event, right? Natural disasters are natural. Hurricanes are natural. They occur in environments that are forced, like ours, but they also occur completely naturally, right? So we can't say that the event was caused by climate change or anthropogenic forcings, just that it might have been made more severe. It was influenced by it. So there's another approach, and it's a little bit more complex. It's a probabilistic approach to event attribution. Now, this doesn't assume that the event occurred. What we do is we try and figure out the probability of the event occurring, its likelihood of occurring, in the natural state. And then we try to figure out the probability of the event occurring in the anthropogenically forced state. Right? And we're going to compare those two probabilities. That'll tell us, how much more likely it is for us to see a storm. But how do we get those two things, right? I started out by telling you, hey, this natural environment, we don't have access to that. So one way to go about doing it is to use computer simulations. So we take computer simulations of our environment, we run them 1,000 times, many thousands of times sometimes, to gauge our uncertainty, and we see how many times the event we're interested in occurred in the computer simulation that was completely natural, that didn't have any of the greenhouse gases, aerosols, or land use changes that we see. And then we compare it to the number of the times that event occurred in the anthropogenically forced state. And then any difference we're attributing to, as long as the models are good and reliable, we're attributing to those anthropogenic forcings, those greenhouse gases. Now, it's not the only way to do it. Another way to do it is to use observations, right? We could do this. We could look at the observations and see how they've changed over time. But we have a problem, right? That thing's really hard to observe, that natural atmosphere, because we don't have access to it. So what do? Well, we assume at some time in the past, this nice 1950s weather forecaster, we use observational data from the past. Say we take the years 1900 to 1950. We'll assume, and it's maybe roughly approximate, that global warming, anthropogenic factors weren't very much in play during that time, right? we'll count the number of events that we saw in those 50 years, and then we'll compare it to the next 50 years, 1950 to 2000, which we do have good observations. And the difference, whatever it is going to be attributable to the anthropogenic factors between the two. So maybe this is a lot for everyone, maybe it's pretty easy, but there's an analogy that there's an analogy that climate scientists have used to convey this to an audience. And so just pick a random baseball player, let's say Barry Bonds. And Barry Bonds has, we can put Barry Bonds in a natural state, say circa 1998, right? Now, in his natural state, Barry Bonds hit 37 home runs in the natural state. But now we can observe Barry in the forced state, 2001, right? You can see there might be a little bit of difference in his physical appearance, but 2001 he hit 49 home runs. Now, if we assume not much about Barry had changed, besides his use of forcings, if not much has changed besides his use of forcings, we could attribute 12 home runs to those forcings, right? Now, I want to be clear. We can't attribute any particular one of those 12 home runs, or any particular one of those 49 home runs, to the forcings. Right? But we can say that the 12 difference is attributable to the use of performance-enhancing forcings. We can do the same thing, this is exactly what I've described, in terms of climate change and extreme events. In the natural scenario, we could have a 25% chance of a heat wave, let's say. In the forced scenario, we have a 75% chance. Now, I've just made these numbers up. They're not illustrative of anything. They are simplified. 75% chance is really high, depending on what you're calling a heat wave. But we can attribute the difference, the additional 50%, to climate change, and the heat wave is 3 times more likely than it otherwise would have been. So what are the limits of this approach? So this doesn't attribute any actual individual events to climate change. It just attributes changes in the risk of an event type occurring, right? That's all we get to do. And it requires reliable observations and reliable models. And we may or may not have those, particularly for some areas in Asia and other areas that are less economically developed. Their observation stations are not as robust as some of the more developed nations' stations might be, and scientists don't tend to spend as much time modeling those areas in some situations as they do in others. There is a tendency to perform extreme event attribution for Europe and North America rather than other places. So also, the limited number of extreme events, because they are extreme, they don't happen all that often. But statistical power, our ability to know statistics, comes from large numbers, samples with large numbers of instances. And since climate extremes don't happen all that often, we have low statistical power. So that leads to greater uncertainty when making these judgments. So, we've talked about hurricanes, we've talked about heat waves. What could we blame on climate change, right? What kinds of events can we talk about? Well, scientists are most confident in their attributions of extreme heat and extreme cold. The reason for this is that these are thermodynamically driven events. It's all about heat and heat transfer. And we know that theory pretty well. We're able to use that exceedingly well. The other events that you might see are more complex, especially hurricanes. Hurricanes are large dynamic events. They take a lot of movement in the atmosphere to create lots of vorticity. You see that big eye wall, the eye of the storm. That's a very complex process. It's very hard to model and understand. Scientists don't yet know what kickstarts a hurricane, why they initially form. That's an active area of current research right now. And because we don't know about those physical mechanisms, we have fairly low confidence in our attributions of dynamically driven events. Droughts and extreme rainfall are somewhere in between. We're a little bit better at that than not. Now, there are still uncertainties associated with all of these events. So I don't want to minimize that, at all. What these results may give is a general indication of where we may be headed and our best guess at what's happening. It's not definite, infallible information. So this brings us kind of to the second question. So given that we could maybe blame some extreme events on climate change, or at least know that climate change influences those extreme events, can we hold people responsible? Can we say that people have a moral obligation, a legal obligation, or a duty to help those that might be impacted by these extreme events? So legally, this has been tried. So recall Katrina. Katrina in 2005 was a devastating storm, hits New Orleans, costs hundreds of billions of dollars, at least 100, possibly up to 1,200 lives lost, lots of destruction. Not long after it occurred, in 2005, there was a lawsuit brought by a group of Mississippi homeowners, and they sued 34 oil and energy companies for the damages that they incurred during the storm. They argued that the defendants, these oil and energy companies, produce significant greenhouse gases. In fact, they're one of the largest producers of greenhouse gases in the United States collectively, far outnumbering anyone else. And these greenhouse gases helped fuel Hurricane Katrina in ways that we now realize seem very plausible. But back then, this was cutting-edge science. And by fueling Hurricane Katrina, it caused these homeowners damage. They wanted to hold the energy companies accountable for that damage. So there are three crucial factors in this legal case. The first was whether the storm could be attributed, could be influenced by climate change, could be said to be influenced by climate change. Second, if fair traceability, and I'll explain what that means in a minute, could be shown. And third, the court's actual jurisdiction for showing that it could remedy this case. So first, the homeowners needed to show that Katrina was influenced by climate change. And this has a very specific legal meaning. And we can't show that any one event was caused by climate change, right? I've kind of said that several times. What we can show is the change in the risk, the probability of it occurring, and the change in the magnitude. Now, legally, there's some precedent from epidemiology that says if you can show that the risk has doubled, then you can say that we can talk about causes, right? You can hold someone liable if the risk of mesothelioma, I always struggle to say that word, the risk of that, if you've been exposed to asbestos, if you've doubled, you can hold a company that exposed you to that asbestos liable, so long as the company can show you weren't going to get that disease some other way. There are some caveats. So the court actually accepted the fact that greenhouse gases would influence Katrina. They did not dispute that. They said that seems plausible. We're not going to talk about that much right now. What they did talk about extensively was fair traceability. And this is the problem for holding people accountable. So fair traceability, legally in the United States, requires that the homeowners show that the particular actions of their defendants led to the damages that they incurred, right? And this would be really hard for those homeowners to show. In fact, they couldn't show it, right? Though those energy companies sued were substantial contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions are well mixed in the atmosphere, right? You don't see some like nice colored greenhouse gas emissions that I put out like floating around that you can individually see which ones are mine, right? We all put it in the atmosphere and it all gets mixed up. So there's no way to trace these individual energy companies' emissions in the atmosphere to show it's their emissions that caused Hurricane Katrina. Furthermore, it's the totality of emissions that causes climate change. I'm using causal talk, but that brings about climate change, right? Just these oil and energy companies might not have been sufficient to bring about the problems that occurred. So the defendants couldn't show that the actions, well, the plaintiffs couldn't show that the actions of these oil companies directly influenced their damages. So the court said, you can't hold them accountable. This is actually a fascinating case because during the time that it was initially brought, in the time that it was actually decided. A very famous case, Massachusetts versus the Environmental Protection Agency, went through to the Supreme Court. And this happened before Comer v. Murphy Oil was decided. And what that case said is that the EPA has to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. Can't shirk away from doing so. It has to. And given that, the court lost, in the process of this case, Comer v. Murphy Oil, the court lost jurisdiction. It couldn't find these oil and energy companies negligent because the authority had just been given to the EPA to regulate this. And since the authority rested with the EPA to regulate it, regulations were not in place at the time, the energy companies did no wrong. That's essentially what happened. So the court could no longer rule on a negligence nuisance claim by these homeowners. And this is still what happens today. You cannot bring a negligent nuisance claim unless the regulations were broken, the EPA regulations were broken in some way, shape, or form. And this has virtually killed any chance that someone has of suing someone else for damages from climate change. Now, there is emerging legal thought that says the energy companies have actively tried to cover up the fact that damage from climate change was likely. And they thought to mislead the public on this when they knew that, in fact, damages were going to be incurred. There's some legal precedent. If you look at tobacco companies, for example, this is what tobacco companies did. And tobacco companies eventually started losing their lawsuits. And this is the avenue forward for legal redress if that's going to occur. But putting that aside, I wanted to talk about loss and damage because no matter what we do at this point, there's going to be some kind of climate change, right? And it's going to affect some people. And it's going to influence, likely, some weather, though can't always say how. So we're going to need to address loss and damage. What is loss and damage? So losses are negative impacts that cannot be repaired or restored. So loss of life, for example, you cannot repair or restore. Loss of unique pieces of culture. This was something that occurred during Katrina. You can't just buy a unique piece of culture. You can't buy a new Mona Lisa if you lost it in the flood. I mean, you might, but it wouldn't be the same one. It wouldn't really have the same value, right? Those things cannot be repaired or restored. Damage are negative impacts. Losses of buildings, losses of financial standing, etc. These things can be repaired and restored. And people are going to lose. Nations are going to lose and be damaged by extreme events in the near and coming future. So the question is, who should be held responsible for these losses and damages, right? So if you think about justice, justice demands that harms incurred by innocent people due to climate change be remedied, right? If you're innocent and someone comes and steals your stuff and they know who stole it, you should get your stuff back, right? You want someone to step in and say, this was wrong. Someone took this, here I can restore where you were previously. The thought is that we owe the same thing when it comes to climate change, right? If there are people who have benefited from climate change and people who have lost from climate change and they are further harmed by climate change, those people who have benefited should make up for those other people's losses. So here's a proposal that scientists have put forward, and some politicians as well. We should distribute funds, compensation, or provide special recognition to victims of climate change, particularly victims of extreme weather. Why? Because extreme weather is really easy to pinpoint, right? When you think of climate change, melting glaciers taking, a very long time, I can tell you what the damage for an extreme weather event was, a year or two afterwards. It's pretty easy to figure out. And so what we should do is we should use event attribution results, the kind of methodologies I talked about before, to differentiate victims of anthropogenic weather from mere bad luck natural weather. This is the claim. But there are several questions one needs to answer in order to do this, and they're not scientific questions. It's not an issue necessarily of, where and how we attribute extreme weather. But one of them is, what degree of increased risk or increased magnitude is required for victimhood? This is a political question. So if we owe something to victims, we need to define who those victims are. And the science doesn't do that for us. It'll give you maybe a rough estimate of how intense a storm would have been, or a rough estimate of how much more likely a particular event could be given climate change. But it won't tell you that the victims are those that have a doubling of risk or a tripling of risk, or the intensity must be an extreme difference from what it would have been previously to declare victimhood, right? Though these are questions that we need to settle politically. And I don't have any answer to that question, but it's going to come up because small island nations are being hit, because droughts are ravaging parts of the world. People are going to want to be able to move. People are going to want to be able to continue to have agriculture, food, places to live. And if they deserve to or not might rest on a question like this. I don't think that it should, but it might. And I want to point out that although we have this great science telling us that climate change might influence extreme events, damage by an extreme event, actual harms, are always socially mediated, right? Being a victim of climate change is a complicated, socially and politically informed status. The vulnerability of a society is more than just its chance of being hit by a storm, right? The vulnerability of a society, it's relevant to how sensitive it is to such impacts, as well as its ability to change and adapt to those impacts. And all of these things are socially mediated. They all depend on how much money you have. They all depend on where you happen to be. Can you move out of that area, right? Can you grow food in that area without, can you grow food that's resilient to the kinds of events that you might see? Do you have the capacity to adapt in any sort of way, to build any kind of infrastructure, right? And the thought for me is lots of these things are going to be influenced by the same kinds of things that influence climate change, right? Oil companies and certain nations and other people have benefited from burning fossil fuels to create, essentially creates climate change. Other people have lost, right? Other people haven't been able to develop. Other people haven't had those opportunities. And that is partly political, right? Partly because they are prevented to immigrate into a different country, partly because they find themselves in a situation where they can't expand, move, or change. And those are all political issues. So damage is socially mediated. In order for us to answer questions about who are victims and who deserves recompense, we need to answer questions about immigration and socioeconomic disparity, and we need to answer questions about who deserves to be considered a victim. Sorry, that was a little circular. So then the question becomes, who should take care of these victims, right? Once we define victimhood, who should take care of them? Who bears the responsibility? Well, often when we talk about this, we talk about the polluter pays. This is one approach to doling out responsibility. So who are the polluters? Well, if we look at this per capita by country, if you're red or orange, you're probably definitely one of the polluters, right? So we could say that countries are on the hook for this, right? Those countries that benefited from this pollution. Now, maybe not all of the countries in red actually benefited from their per capita emissions, right? So you might be asking people who didn't benefit to pay. And that might be a struggle for some countries in some areas. South Africa might be one of those. Or perhaps a different group should be able to pay. Polluters tend to be, in some sense, private companies, right? They've gained a lot from the burning of fossil fuels. Maybe they should be the ones to pay. That seems like great. You know, if you're a lefty, maybe you hate the corporate man. But you know, it's much more complicated than this, right? I mean, all the individuals are the ones who consumed that energy produced, right? There was sufficient demand. Governments at various points in history were promoting fossil fuel use, telling their citizens to use it, giving subsidies to various companies, right? They aren't free. You can't just pick out a private company and say, aha, these were the evil people that made us all do it. It doesn't quite work that way. Or maybe it should be some kind of individual that has to pay for this, right? Maybe we should pick out some people with socioeconomic status of some particular level, like the people who can afford self-driving cars so they can read the paper during. Maybe these people should be paid. There are lots of different ways to adjudicate who bears responsibility. And what I want to say is these are not going to be settled by the science. If you talk to climate scientists, perhaps not if you talk to those who try to attribute extreme weather, but climate scientists think that they are 10 years beyond where they need to be to have the right kind of policies in place to fix climate change. I had a conversation with one the other day, and that's what they said. We're 10 years beyond where we need to be. All the information is there. We need to act politically, and the political problem is the real problem. So this brings me to the end of my talk. So these are my conclusions. We can't say that climate change causes extreme weather, but we are showing that it may have some influence on it. Legal attempts to hold private companies responsible in the US have so far failed, and it's unlikely that they will succeed in the future. Climate change victims deserve recognition, but it's not clear that this kind of event attribution science that I've been investigating can tell us how to do that. It's not sufficient, nor does it tell us where the responsibility rests. Thank you very much.
We have time for some questions.
I'm happy to answer any questions you have. I'm on camera, so make them exciting. Yeah, go right ahead.
This is kind of exciting to me. I've been writing a paper with Michael, and he took it out of the paper because it was perhaps a bit too exciting for Michael.
Okay.
I suggested that actually we can hold a certain group of people responsible, and I think that, I know it's an American, I'm U of T graduate work as well.
Oh, great.
So I know it's a very big American thing that you sue someone and you get money, or a corporation, and that's really
It's
great
just what we do
for
on a
you,
daily
right?
basis, yeah.
Yeah, that's just really great for you. But the truth is, this isn't just about you and you and you and the few people who are going to succeed about that. This is like a public threat at a global level. So I think that it would be possible to go back to the Rome Statute that initiated the International Criminal Court and persuade the International Criminal Court that it actually has plenty of space for them to hold corporate leaders and other people who are in positions of power who have done massive damage to populations, and on the basis of that, have the International Criminal Court prosecute the people who are responsible and behind the climate denial industry. Because all those people who you're saying maybe we should hold them responsible because they're driving the car or they're the consumer and there was demand on their part, a lot of their consumer agreeability was actually manipulated. And if you buy the climate denial. We're also talking here about things that will happen if you don't and could happen, even though much of your evidence was stuff that's already happened, much of it recently. Much of the conversation was about what will happen. If you look at the picture in Africa, you find that, like right now, for example, there are 24 countries in food crisis. 19 of them have been in food crisis for 8 or more of the last 10 years. They have what you called adaptability capacity. They don't have that if it's year after year after year after year.
Right.
The drought in Ethiopia was directly connected to climate change in 2012 in a paper published by Christidis Lot et al. So we know that there's hundreds of thousands of people who are at risk of starvation, and a massive humanitarian crisis in food security is occurring already right now in Africa. And I think that those people who are getting extremely rich off of the fossil fuel industry and fueling the denial campaign could be held accountable, and if they were found guilty and their assets were seized and liquidated, that could provide the financing to support. And I'm not talking about compensation, I'm talking about supporting so they were left there. I'm talking about alleviating caring and alleviating suffering rather than direct compensation.
Yeah, and so I'm not going to, I think that those are all great points. One thing that I will point out, you're right, everything that I talked about is about events that have already happened. Event attribution always, in order to attribute event, it needs to have happened. You can't attribute events that have not happened yet. Holding people accountable in the way that you suggest is an open area of exploration, right? There are a lot of different plans and a lot of different reasons, moral and political, why people should be held accountable. I think in the United States anyway, the most likely way for that to occur is what you mentioned, that there is misleading statements, right? That there has been a systematic campaign of doubt, like the merchants of doubt, and rescues. There's been a systematic campaign that has prevented people, essentially, from undergoing the adaptations that they should have, taking the actions that they should have, and their legal responsibility, the legal cases are going to rest on that one fact, that they were misleading people.
Do you think it strengthens it that many of those people who are the experts engineering that process cut their teeth on the tobacco denial campaign?
Well, so it depends what you mean by engineering that process. If you mean like sites and like those people, it might help that there was a connection between those two things for sure. But I don't think I'm not sure if that's going to be any kind of smoking gun against it. What I do want to say is at the international level, there's a lot of concern about how compensation and how reparations might be paid right now. This is something that keeps getting pushed back and pushed back and pushed back in the international community, and those that are being damaged, like you specified, are very eager to settle this question because damage is occurring now, and we don't want that to just continue indefinitely. Right.
Internationally, I mean, UNFCCC,
yeah,
and like the
UNFCCC.
Climate Adaptation Fund is a way of getting countries to pay back.
Particularly the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. It's currently under the auspices of adaptation, but no one wants it. No one wants it. Some people want it to be, other people do not want it to be, so it can have some more leeway on that. But that's the area where there's the significant room for this kind of science and for other kinds of science to be linked to compensation in some pretty strong ways.
Thank you.
Yes.
The lawsuit that you mentioned earlier that failed because the EPA took over regulation.
Yeah.
Do you think lawsuits against the EPA for failure to regulate would be more successful?
So that lawsuit, just to point out, that lawsuit failed for multiple reasons, and I gave you the most pressing and most interesting of those reasons. So there's a distinction between private liability and like public kinds of lawsuits. Public kinds of lawsuits are much more likely to be successful, but they can be brought in a very limited number of circumstances. So if the EPA failed to follow its own regulations, for example, in terms of soliciting community feedback, in terms of listening to the right people, in terms of doing studies in the correct kind of way, citizens and states can bring lawsuits against the EPA for those reasons. And those are pretty successful, actually, for the most part, because it's usually fairly clear cut. Now, it's much harder to bring a lawsuit being like, you're not regulating enough because there's too much CO2 in the atmosphere and I want it to be lower. I think this is the actual level that we should be striving for, or something like that. That would be actually hard to bring against the EPA. And the EPA right now is walking back a lot of its environmental protection regulations as much as it legally can. And I am surprised that people have not been talking more about their mandate, because they have to do this. They have to regulate. They cannot decline for political reasons to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. And it seems to me like they may be doing that in some of their most recent actions. But I'm a philosopher playing legal scholar in some instances, not a legal scholar myself. So I'd love if there's a legal scholar who to hear more about that. Yeah.
So there were 3 points about the lawsuit. The first one was climate change.
It's causality, basically.
Causality,
Influence. Yeah.
And you said that point didn't get addressed. Did they affirm that? Did the court affirm that, or did they just concede the point because they're lawyers and not scientists?
The court basically said that this, for all we know, this seems plausible. And then there are other grounds on which it dismissed the case, but it seemed to grant that even if it said this seems plausible, we'll grant that it could be the case. Even if it is the case, though, this lawsuit can't go forward for these reasons. Right. But it seemed as if a judge would accept the kind of reasoning that I displayed early on in the talk. Yeah?
We'll have you take a rather large view. The adequacy or inadequacy of what Obama managed in the Paris climate accords, any possible, minus Trump, possibility that that would do something? Much more broadly, what kinds of things would you assume in the long run will really be forcing doing something about climate change? Because, quite frankly, legal lawsuits in the U.S. strike me as not going to do anything about the global issues that are really problematic right now.
Yeah, so what can we do long term about climate change? This is really hard. I can tell you what probably won't work. So for 20 years or so, last 20 years, it's interesting. At the end of Inconvenient Truth, the documentary that introduced many people to this issue as a serious issue, the ending has this ending. It says, and this is what you can do. Recycle, screw in some LED light bulbs, and, do those kinds of things. It puts the onus on the individual end user of electricity, power, and food. And those kinds of solutions are not going to work to fix climate change. What solutions are going to work? I mean, the Paris Agreement seemed like, given the current situation, seemed like a great agreement. Who knows if it will hold? The way that targets are set in that agreement is a little strange. People probably are going to get to fudge the figures, but it's an encouraging thing to see the international community get on board with an agreement that had ambitious goals, if not anything. And the thing about the way that agreement was formed, and maybe the Committee of Island Nations, they have an
Small
official
Island
name.
States, SIS.
Yeah, the Small Island States. That group getting together and acting as a bloc during those negotiations was an amazing and powerful thing. I think it brought a lot of citizens onto their side, made their issues public in ways that it wasn't previously, and gave them a lot of leverage when it came to the table to negotiate. And I think those kinds of actions on the part of those being most affected will pay dividends in the long run for helping to resolve climate change. Other questions? Yeah.
So the U.S. military has basically done a lot of studies on climate change. They believe that it's probably the biggest threat that the U.S. military actually faces. I imagine militaries all over the world are reaching the same conclusions. So one of the things that no one really talks about is what is the military response to climate change. And, it seems like everyone's talking political, but sooner or later, the military, I think, is going to step in and say, if there's enough extreme weather events or whatever, that you're going to have huge populations migrating and whatnot. I guess I'm not sure how to pose this as a question, but everyone seems to forget about that aspect of climate change.
Yes.
So sooner or later, the militaries of all these nations are going to come into play.
Yes.
Victims and whatnot, and recompense and whatnot is going to basically get swept under the rug in a pretty ugly way.
It could. Let's hope it doesn't get to that, right? I mean, maybe recompense, maybe reparations can help prevent that kind of situation, right? You can imagine that by supporting the communities that might otherwise want to immigrate or migrate, we can reduce violence in the wake of climate change. But you're completely right. The military has spent a lot of money to figure out how climate change is both going to affect its ability to deploy troops and it's going to affect stability around the world. I don't know a lot about the finer details of that, but when you think about migration or immigration, one of the things the Puerto Rican official has said is that, to Trump, is that if you don't help us, we are U.S. citizens, you owe us something, and we're all going to move to the mainland, right? Like, there's going to be an exodus of people because it's going to be really hard to live where we live because it was just destroyed. And probably the most expeditious way for us to get back on our feet is to move to the mainland. They're U.S. citizens. They should come to the mainland if they need to come to the mainland, of course. But it shows the consequences of what can happen, that you could have a mass migration even within our country, that we would need to figure out how best to accommodate those people.
Quick,
Yeah.
just to play devil's advocate.
Sure.
You said something about at the end of Inconvenient Truth that screwing in a few more light bulbs or recycling isn't going to help. But one of the takeaways, at least from the documentary version of Merchants of Doubt, is the reason those scientists went from the smoking controversy to climate change was not money. It was because they felt like a way of life was being threatened.
Yeah.
And so, in a sense, isn't it a bunch of individual decisions, like wanting to live on the coast, wanting to fly jet airplanes, wanting to have electricity? Would we have to fundamentally change our way of life to tackle long-term climate change?
I mean, I wish I had done the calculations on that to tell you that what we would need to change in order to fix climate change. I think we'll need to fundamentally change our way of life. How fundamental? I'm not sure. I don't know the answer to that question. But I don't think
everybody become a vegetarian.
But I don't think it's going to come from. I don't think everyone's going to individually decide to have that kind of outcome. I think that they, not force, but we're going to need to provide incentive for people to do that. I can't imagine everyone doing it just on their own volition. And so there needs to be some kinds of systematic top-down programs to change people's lifestyle and to do it incrementally or to do it accordingly. And without those kinds of programs, without some kind of high top-down level, and this can be international down, but I mean, states and municipalities right now are taking the lead on this, and they are making bigger impacts than national governments have been able to do. So those kinds of programs, I think, are going to be the ones that eventually, hopefully, get us out of this. Yeah, you have thoughts.
I just wanted to comment on that.
Yeah.
Columbia did the math in 2007 in heat, and he showed that in fact we don't need to sacrifice our lifestyle at all. The only problem or the only issue he couldn't resolve was love miles, which is flying to see your family. But other than that, he had the whole thing worked out in terms of dwellings and etc. So clearly what's needed is not just individual shift, but societal shift to green energies. One thing we do know for certain, though, is that if we don't mitigate and provide adaptation for the areas that are already hurting, it's radically going to change our lifestyles.
Well, yes, but I mean, there are some ways we don't need to adjust our lifestyle. Like, so we should just continue building on the coast of Florida? I don't think that's true, right? So it really does depend what you mean by fundamental shift in lifestyle.
Well, I mean, there's still time for mitigation to
Yes.
slow down
Yes.
and perhaps reverse. In which case, you could build in Florida all you want, right? I mean,
Well,
a lot of the problems go away if mitigation happens and happens quickly. But pretty soon it gets to a point where not all the mitigation in the world's going to help because we won't be able to ride it out.
Yes. When thinking about extreme weather, though, and extreme weather's impacts, living in Florida is still a bad idea.
It's a swamp.
Right? Yes.
You're talking about top-down regulation when it comes to way of life, and you're talking about specific individuals in society, or are you talking more about industry? Because a lot of times it's industry where a lot of the really large resource consumption happens, particularly water with agriculture. They're developing new technologies, they use a lot less, or even just different farming methods and things like that. So we're talking about regulation for industries where a lot of that consumption is happening, or we're talking about you can't live your life like this.
Well, I mean, so things that could work: carbon taxes, cap and trade schemes. California and Quebec have one. That's, I think they were doing it. It's going fairly well, as far as I can tell. Those kinds of programs are likely to be helpful in my mind. I'm a philosopher of science, not a politics scholar, so I'm most interested in the way that science is influencing the way that those policy discussions take place. But I would think that those kinds of schemes, and I think that we need a radical shift in the way that we value other individuals, right, and what we value about life. And we need to be much more aware about how our international colleagues may be struggling, and that we have largely been the ones to benefit about this. And we need to have those kinds of value discussions in policy. That's what I want to get to. Part of this project is to say something like, we have all this science that can show us these kinds of things. It may have large uncertainties in certain areas, but really you need to figure out what it is that we're valuing. Who are the people that need to be helped? Who are the people that need to be held responsible? Where is the money going to come from, right? I don't think you can just sit back and say something like, there's a bunch of people, they got hit by some weather, they weren't adapted to it, and we don't have any responsibility to help them. I think we do. And the question is, well, where does that responsibility come from? Who is responsible, and how do we deploy that responsibility in accordance with the values and principles that we hold? And we're not having that debate. That public debate just isn't happening, at least as far as I can see it. And that's where I want it to go.
So Mike, my colleague Mike Goldsby is the last question.
Great.
Okay, so I'm a bit more familiar with your work than perhaps with the rest of the crowd. So I want to go ahead and push. So one thing you've criticized, you didn't criticize as much here, but criticize probability event attribution. Yeah. You suggest, hey, look, I'm a little worried about actually doing that. And then you say things like, look, I think damages, I think I kind of buy a lot of your criticisms of that. And then you say, hey, look, this notion of damages, loss, and victimhood, and responsibility, these are socially mediated sort of issues.
Yep.
Well, there's a problem with pushing that and punting that to a social mediated sort of situation. Take it in mitigation context, there's actually an idea being floated around that the rest of the world needs to bribe the U.S. to cut its emissions, right? Because we have the political strength in some respect,
yep.
we can browbeat the rest of the world into doing what we want. So I guess what I'm wondering is, look, these corporations or whatever, the people that do have this power, they are going to actually have some political power and political influence to socially mediate things and to stonewall it a long time. So maybe probability event attribution is some sense, it's not perfect, but it's at least some weak evidence that that there is something attributable to these sorts of actors. And I'm wondering if maybe that might be one use that wasn't listed originally in your social motivations. This is for another talk, I apologize. It wasn't listed in there, but I'm thinking this is something that, in light of the talk that I saw today, where we say, hey, look, this has got to be socially mediated. This might actually be one tool that will help leverage some of that social mediation to get us onto a path of probably a more just recompensation packages.
So one of the things that I think, and I hope this responds to your question, one of the things that I think event attribution is good at, I doubt I don't want people to say, this storm, the likelihood of this storm was caused by it, or because this storm is more likely, then we can blame it fully on climate change. We might be able to blame the magnitude difference on it, I understand that. One of the things that I think it could be used for is to provide an example of the kind of thing that we should be worried about happening in climate change. It might be able to do that. I don't think event attribution is needed for that kind of thing.
Okay.
Right? There's a lot of qualitative evidence that it's going to get hotter. Heat waves are going to increase, right? There's a lot of predictive modeling efforts that show you what hurricanes might do, although those are fairly uncertain, but that heat waves, etc., will happen. So I don't think we need probabilistic event attribution for that. But there's a difference. The context in which the discussion of loss and damage occurs is very different than the context of where mitigation occurs, right? Mitigation's always future-oriented. Loss and damage is always past-oriented, right? So our ethical obligations to cut emissions might actually have no bearing on our ethical obligations to address those that have been harmed, right? Because we might not have obligations to future generations, pretend that we don't, right? But we should still have obligations to people who have incurred harms by our actions, right? So those two questions, at least from an ethical perspective, can often be separated. And that's what I try to do, although discussion of climate change is always wide-ranging. So, right.
Thank you very much, Greg.
Thank you. Thank you for all the great questions.